Okay, let me just start by saying that the topic for this episode was largely influenced by two events that didn't happen too far off from each other and are also being spoken about right now within the present, not too far off from each other, which is very interesting in my opinion. And especially considering the fact that people are looking at, both of those events in hindsight as bad decisions that were made, I look at it now and I'm like, I think maybe we're being a little too harsh on the actors, or should I say the people involved, and maybe the only reason we can make such judgments is because we're looking at things in the past, not necessarily in the present. What am I talking about? I am going to get into that in a bit, but before I can do any of that, I should have started with an intro. So let me just give one real quick, then I can get into my thoughts on the entire thing. So welcome to the Breakdown Podcast, where I talk about love, sex, and relationships from a guy's perspective, as well as a bunch of other guy shit. The man on the mic is Sir Danver B. This is a shorter, less edity, no instrumentally version of the podcast, where I basically discuss one topic, I keep it short, and I do very minimal editing because I'm on break from the full episodes. And I basically get to share my thoughts on stuff that I've been thinking about but didn't exactly make it to the full episodes. Now, this episode is going to be a little bit different in that I'm not going to involve one story for the entire topic. It's actually a collection of different things. So the basis of where all of this started is actually two different stories or two different events that happened not too far off from each other, and the fact that there is quite a bit of correlation there. But that also involves me bringing in a couple of other stories, or at least a couple of other instances, whereby some of what it is that I'm talking about get fleshed out particularly well. Where am I coming from? Let me get right into it. So, not too long ago, I stumbled across a particularly interesting post where someone was busy talking about Sanaipei Tande and the offer that she got from radio presenter Maina Kageni of 500,000 Kenyan shillings, and she'd be getting that every single month, plus she'd also get a nice house, all in exchange for having Maina Kageni's kid. And she turned down the offer. Now, ever since that time, people have brought up this discussion about whether she made the right decision or a wrong one. Every couple of times whenever she, pops back into the limelight and people start talking about her, maybe because she's trending or maybe because she's appeared somewhere and people are talking about it. And it's been pretty interesting whenever you hear people discuss about it, whenever you read the discussions that people have regarding this entire thing. Because oftentimes, people are coming out and they're like, oh, she should have taken the money, or, oh, if she'd have done that, blah, 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 and blah would have happened. And the truth of it is, whatever decision she made was her decision at that time. But with that story in mind, I want to link another story and then kind of give an unpopular opinion, or just give a very, very open opinion that I think many of us would probably want to listen to. Now, if you remember, they say that this story is from around 07. I'll probably call it 08, 09, but I could be wrong. But you look at it, somewhere around 2008, Nick Cannon and Mariah Carey got married. Now, for those of you all that don't know who those two are, either you're not a millennial, or maybe you're just too young, or maybe, you just didn't care about pop culture back in the day. But back then, when it happened, it was considered to be one of the wildest things that had happened in, can I call it fame, or in show business? You could even call it the music industry in the US, because it was one of those ones where it was such a wild situation, because Nick Cannon was about 28 years old at the time, Mariah Carey was around 40. So it seemed so wild that this young guy would marry this much older woman who's so much more successful, makes a shit ton more money. Even though he's kind of doing his thing, he decided to be with her. And the interesting part about it is, about 8 years later, they got divorced. And people used to think that Mariah Carey was the one that divorced Nick. Then very recently, I saw a clip where Nick Cannon was talking about how he was the one who filed for divorce. And he felt during that time, to some degree, that he was Mariah Carey's husband and he didn't have a chance to be his own man, because he felt like he was being pulled into her world and there was nothing that he could do about that whole situation, especially considering that she was more famous than he is and she was making a shit ton more money than he was at that time. And when this clip ended up hitting social media not too long ago, a lot of people started attacking Nick Cannon about it. And, people are busy talking about how, he's such an insecure man. It's this insecurity that was bad. You had such a good wife, blah, blah, blah. And the thing is, I can understand why he would do that at that time. Like, I'm not saying that it was a great idea, but, I can understand why the guy would choose to do that. And the thing is, in both Sanaipei Tande and Nick Cannon's situation, people are kind of losing their shits right now, and they're like, they should have done the opposite of what they did. But in my opinion, I feel like they probably made the best decision based off of the time that they were living in. And that is what informed the idea that sometimes what makes a decision good or bad isn't really a moral right or wrong. It's the time in which it's being made and how society perceives that decision at that time. And the worst part about society is they'll have a different perception then, but they'll forget that they had that perception, then later down the road come back and judge you for not taking a different decision because they judge you based on hindsight, not necessarily in the present time. Now, I am going to get into the exact reasons why I feel that was the case for each of these people. But before I do that, let me try and build up on this idea by talking about Kim Kardashian for a little bit. Now, if you look at Kim Kardashian right now, she's a billionaire. She owns the Skims brand. She's kind of looked at as a business mogul, as a social media mogul of sorts, if you could look at her like that. And, she's been a reality TV star. And she's also dated and married some very, very high-level individuals. But when you kind of look at where her beginnings were, they weren't exactly the best. She kind of popped out and became famous because of, let's be quite honest, the sex tape. Her sex tape with Reggie is basically what catapulted the family into the spotlight, and you can say gave them a lot of what made their wealth right now. Because if it wasn't for the sex tape, they wouldn't have had the first season of Keeping Up with the Kardashians. Like, it was all basically pre-planned. And you look at it right now, and I'm not saying that what she did was the best thing ever, but you can kind of understand how what she did, when you look at it now, considering everything she's managed to build, doesn't seem all that bad. I'm not saying that it's a good idea or that anyone should really take it up, but it doesn't seem like it's all that bad considering what she's managed to build and grow ever since then. But you look at how people perceived her back in 2009, and to be quite honest, she was probably one of the most scandalous people that was in the spotlight at that time, because no one was known for such. And granted, the kind of fame that she managed to garner from that was actually quite mad. And people didn't really think that such a thing would be a good idea, up until they decided to try it. And unfortunately, it ended up working for Kim K, but not for a lot of people that tried the same exact thing. But, story for another day. So you look at it, her decision seemed bad then, but you look at it today for the person that would want to try and grow their wealth, and it doesn't actually seem like such a bad idea. You look at the story of Danielle Bregoli, aka Bad Baby, aka the Cash Me Outside girl. Like, she got on to Dr. Phil and she kind of made, a scene which did end up becoming viral. And oddly enough, you look at the virality that came after that and the fact that she was on OnlyFans for, I think it was like a year and a half, and she garnered 50 plus mil. And does it seem like it was such a bad idea for her to behave the way she behaved? Like, I'm not saying that it's a good idea or that it was a good decision, but in as much as they aren't the best examples, a lot of what they did or a lot of where they started didn't look all that good, which still goes to inform what I said initially, which was sometimes the decisions that people may make in the moment may be considered good or bad, but a lot of times it's not really a case of moral right or wrong, it's just a case of timing. Now, don't get me wrong, like those ones, I would argue that they're also morally not right. But those are more extreme examples of them going against the grain and coming out successful. Now, you go back to the story of Nick Cannon and Sanaipei Tande, and I feel like, in as much as I took extremes, this one seems a little closer to reality, to a point where you can kind of get it. Now, let me take Nick Cannon so that I can finish with Sanaipei Tande, because, Sanaipei Tande, of course. Now, Nick Cannon was doing pretty well in Nickelodeon. The guy did pretty well as a creative guy. And, in media during that time, Nick Cannon was doing pretty well for himself, both on the front end and also on the back end. So you can say that Mans was, doing particularly well for himself. So he ends up with Mariah Carey. Incredibly successful woman, much older than his age. But dude, decided that he wants to be with her. They end up getting married. And then the guy starts feeling like he is basically being suffocated, or he's basically being pulled into her world, and he's not standing out on his own. He's being known as Mariah Carey's husband as opposed to being Nick Cannon. And you would argue that, that's insecurity, but back during that time, between 2008 and 2016, we weren't hearing of too many cases of men who were in a position where their women were making significantly more than they were, and they had to be the supportive partner. Nowadays, we're hearing a lot more of that, and it's even being accepted, and, men are being told, what, there's nothing wrong with your babe earning more than you. But when you're looking at back in the day, like that was frowned upon, and I'm sure the guy must have felt that pressure from society where he needs to come out and stand up as his own man and, kind of take the lead and shit. And, especially if you're trying to go toe-to-toe with Mariah Carey, that can seem a little closer to impossible, not unless if you're doing significantly better than her initially. Or you build up a tech platform or some interesting piece of social media that catches on with the public, like Instagram or, Facebook or some shit. Like, it was incredibly hard to actually match up to what Mariah Carey had managed to achieve, both financially and success-wise. So I can get why he would feel that way and why he would choose to take that route to a particular degree. So given his current reality and, the fact that, they left each other and he got maybe 10 other kids with women, given his reality right now, can you say that he made a bad decision back then, either getting married or even getting divorced from Mariah Carey? I wouldn't say so, because we're looking at it from the hindsight. Back then, him getting married was considered wild, and him divorcing just seemed perfectly okay, considering that they're celebrities and they divorce all the time. But now you look at Sanaipei Tande, and it becomes a little bit clearer if you look at her situation. When she was being given that offer, she was basically at the heights of her career. Not at the peak, might I add, but definitely at the heights of her career as a media person in general. She had gotten into music. She was doing great. She had a radio job. She was making pretty good bank. And, people wanted to be with Sanaipei Tande. She was a hot person that people wanted to be with or wanted to be. So Mai Nakageni goes ahead, makes that offer. It looks lucrative, but also take into consideration that this was the 2000s. Women during that time were busy trying to show that they have the potential and they can build some shit and they're doing pretty well for themselves. Not right now when people are going through economic hardship and they want to run away from capitalism. Nah, they were doing pretty well for themselves. So she gets an offer like that, and she's basically doing great for herself at that time. And of course she'd say no. Of course she would. Most young women at that time were basically having the mindset of, whatever it is that you're offering me, I can go and I can make it myself. Just give me time. I'll definitely manage to pull it off. Even close to 10 years after that, I remember talking to babes that I was in uni with, and they're like, oh, instead of doing this, this, and this, I'll go and I'll become successful so that I don't have to rely on my mans to get me this and this. I could hear that speech coming from babes, all the way even into the 2010s. But now, where there's a lot of women who've realized that the rat race of capitalism isn't really all that worth it and they want to be stay-at-home moms, of course it seems like she made an error. Of course it seems like, she missed out. Andrew Kibe came out and was busy hitting at her, and he's like, oh, is she making that kind of money right now? Is she living in as nice of a house as she was offered back then right now? Like, people will definitely go and hit at her, but at that time, especially given where she was, if she'd have taken Maina Kageni's offer, of course it would have looked like she was wasting her potential. It would have looked like she's basically selling out and she's choosing like the cop-out reason. She's taking the easy way, yet she's a smart woman that's managed to accomplish a bunch of shit on her own. So given her situation, I think she made a perfectly correct decision at that time. Now, you could argue that if the her of right now was given that option and she's taken back in time to that particular situation where she's in front of Maina Kageni and she's being given that offer, then maybe you could argue that she might have said yes. I would argue that she'd have still said no while the mics were on, but once the mics go off, she's like, you know what, I'll take it, we can do something in writing, but let's just keep it on the hush hush. I think that's what she'd probably do. Granted, I could be wrong. Maybe she'd have made the same decision. Maybe she'd have done differently. But all in all I'm trying to say is back then, that wasn't the smart decision. The smart decision is you put in the work because, there's a lot of successful women. She's charting a path for herself and for whoever it is that looks up to her. But today, where the idea of potential and making money and survival seem like very different concepts right now, I can get why someone would say that if you offered me $500,000 and a nice house just to have your kid or kids, I'd probably take it. So all this to say, and to kind of conclude all of this, what I am trying to say is whatever decisions that you may make today may seem weird, but if it feels right to you, then go ahead and do it. Now, of course, I'm not telling you that your situation will turn out like Kim K's and you'll be ultra successful in every single one of them, but maybe in 10 years, people might be looking at it like it was a good decision or that it was a good thing. Or on the other hand, it could be a case of 10 years later, it's still being looked at as the shittiest decision you ever made. But the truth of it is you'll never really know unless you try it. So, it still could be shit, but, why not try it either way? Although, then again, now that I think about it, maybe I could be giving bad advice in this particular episode. I don't know. Either way, I want your thoughts on it. The DMs are open on IG. It is at the Breaktime _podcast. On Facebook, it is at the Breaktime Podcast. On X, it is at Bagaka the D. And on Bluesky, it is at the breaktimepod.bsky.social. Thank you so much for listening all the way till the end, and I will catch you guys on the next break.